By request of the listener, we are going to continue with al-Arabi. We ask ourselves, who is the great wisest of all? Huh? Who's the wisest? We are going to ask the greatest master, who's... Here we are continuing about circles, every line. We are looking at the circles and circumference. Every line that emerges from the center point to the encompassing circumference is equal to its companions and reaches its end at a point on the circumference. In its essence, the center point does not become plural or increase despite the manyness of the lines emerging from it towards the circumference. It is the contrary.
Isn't it amazing that as many lines as end at the circumference, begin at the point, one single point? It's quite an amazing thing.
It is, isn't it? It's like infinity. It is the contrary of every point on the circumference through its essence. Were it to be the contrary of one point on the circumference with other than that with which it is the contrary of another point, it
Do you know how that happens?
No.
Because the point is one, and the beginning of the line is one, the same point.
Yeah.
So
it would become divided and could not be one. But it is one, so it is the contrary of all the points, despite their manyness. Only through its own essence, this manyness has become manifest from the one, an entity without the one becoming many of its essence. This shows the falsity.
It's funny, I thought about it before you read it.
What? What did you think?
About that, the peculiarity of the one with the infinity around. How it's possible.
The one. The one is the Wujud. And manyness has become manifest from the one in entity without the one becoming many in its essence. This shows the falsity of words of those who say, quote, nothing proceeds from the one but one. That's not true.
Infinity proceeds, huh?
The line that emerges from the center point towards one point on the encompassing circumference is the specific face that every existent thing has from its creator is indicated by his words. Our only word to a thing when we desire it is to say to it, quote, be. So it comes to be. Here the, quote, desire is the line that we have supposed as emerging from the center point of the circle to the circumference. It is the divine face turning that entifies the divine face turning now. That entifies the point on the circumference. So God's divine face turns.
That's how the Platonic theology goes.
The face turning?
From the one.
Yeah, they mentioned face turning. So that's God's face. God, divine face turning that edifies the point on the circumference through giving it existence. After all, the circumference is nothing but the circle of the possible things, and the center point that edifies the points on the circumference is the necessary wujud in itself. The thing in itself. Is that the thing in itself? The supposed circle is the circle of the genera of the possible things. We have restricted to the spatially confined substances. Substances not spatially confined, endangered qualities. You should do some artwork based on his philosophy.
My artwork is based on that philosophy.
That which is not restricted is the wujud of the species and the individuals. This arrives newly from each point of every circle. For within the circles of the species arrive newly, and from the circles of the circles of species and the individuals. So know this. So know this, he says. Do you know it? Just know it. So know it. Curious fellow. The root of all this is the first point, the line that connects the center point with the edified point on the circumference extends from the circle to the points that are born from it in the outside semicircle. Possible circles emerge from this semicircle. The cause of this is the distinction between the necessary wujud in itself and the possible thing. A perfect circle cannot become manifest from the possible thing that is the circle of the generi, for then this circle would share in that through which distinction occurs. But this is possible, so a perfect circle cannot be engendered through the generea. Therefore becomes clear the imperfection of the possible thing in the face of the perfection of the necessary wujud in itself. The form of the affair is represented by the diagram 6.2. This is the form of the shape of the genera and the species without the aim of being exhaustive, for the species have species until they finally reach the last species, just as they finally reach the genus of the genera. al-Arabi describes the point that generates the circles of the genera, species, and individuals in chapter 369. I don't know, like these chapters. Are they his chapters? He has such a large book. Remember how they said they were going to translate that book, but it was going to be like God knows how many huge volumes?
Yeah, I did.
That book is insanely big.
What book?
The Futu Hot. Remember those black books we saw up there? And how many were they going to have? 20?
Oh, that's what you were.
Remember that book?
Yeah. No.
That book is insanely big.
So it's the same personality reading.
And it's not translated.
It is the same.
Yes.
Reading.
Yeah.
Really?
It's al-Arabi. From which several sections have already been quoted. The chapter is called, quote, On the True Knowledge of the Way Stations of the Keys to the Storehouses of Magnificence. Before enumerating the individual keys, the sheikh, this is the greatest of all sheikhs, describes the storehouses as the various generi that contain the species and the individuals. In this long introduction out to the chapter, he reviews several of his most important themes. Now he has some diagram here. Wow, it's so abstract. Here's the dust. This is like me here. The dust. What are you?
Mm-hmm.
God is the presence, and I would be the dust. Are you the intellect, or the soul, or
Just keep reading.
The most excellent thing through which God has shown magnificence to his servants is knowledge. When God bestows knowledge on someone, he granted him the most eminent of attributes and the greatest of gifts. According to al-Arabi. Of course, al-Arabi. He's the greatest, I think. Is he the greatest? Who's the wisest of all?
He is, I guess, wise.
Although knowledge is eminent in essence, it has another eminence that occurs to it from the object of knowledge, and it is an attribute that becomes connected to all things. The keys are eminent in keeping with the eminence of the storehouses, and the storehouses are eminent in keeping with what has been stored within them. The real existence is the greatest, most majestic, the most eminent of existent things. Hence, knowledge of it is the most eminent, greatest, and the most majestic of knowledges. Then the affair descends in eminence until the last object of knowledge. God, how does he know all this stuff?
He's amazing.
He's way too smart. Well, we were talking more about the circles of Wujud in part 2, and we were asked the question, who is the wisest of all?
Where did he live?
When did he live? Well, we're not asking basic questions at this point. I have to stop there, I think. We had looked at. The topic was really we're in the topic of the circles of Wujud on page 227.